Good evening, and thank you all for joining us once again for another lecture in the Graduate International Colloquium series. Before Mare, Nostrum, Redivivuum, we went fancy with the Latin name anyway. The Place of Islands in the Mediterranean, which is a year-long academic series focused on furthering the study of islands at Brown University. With that being said, it is with great pleasure that I introduce a good friend of the Tchaikovsky Institute, Dr. Scott Fitzpatrick. Despite that Scott was actually one of the guest speakers at the surprised Regional Approaches to Society and Complexity Studies in honor of John F. Cherry, it might be worth reintroducing our guest once again. Dr. Scott Fitzpatrick is an archaeologist who specializes in the archaeology of island and coastal regions, particularly the Pacific and the Caribbean. Much of his research focuses on colonization events, seafaring strategies, adaptations to smaller islands, exchange systems, chronometric techniques, and human impacts of ancient environments. He's a very, very busy guy. On top of that, he has some very fascinating active field projects in Palau and other islands in the Caribbean. Dr. Fitzpatrick is also one of the founding co-editors of the Journal of Island and Coastal Archaeology, as well as the associate editor for Archaeology in Oceania, and serves on the editorial boards for at least 3 other journals. All of this is to say that Scott is a very, very active researcher. And his extensive publication list includes also a number of seminal books, such as Voyages of Discovery, The Archaeology of Islands, as well as Island Shores, Distant Pasts, Archaeological and Biological Perspectives on the Pre-Columbian Settlement of the Caribbean. So keeping in mind his enviable publication output, and among which he also has several awarded funding grants, Scott will be talking to us tonight about currents and commodities, how oceanographic effects influence the prehistoric colonization of islands. So please help me welcome Dr. Scott Fitzpatrick.
Well, thank you, Clive, and many others for the kind invitation to be here tonight. This is the second time I've been here, as Clive said, in the last 2 months. And I was invited 5 or 6 years ago to also be here. And I was thinking to myself today that almost warrants temporary office space here at the Tchaikovsky. So I'm just throwing out there, Peter and John. No, it's really a pleasure to be here again tonight. I first started doing archaeological field work on islands, in particular the Caribbean, and I spent a number of years both as an undergraduate and a master's student working on the island of Barbados. And that experience was really pivotal in a number of different ways, but after having spent enough time there, for a number of reasons, I just chose to try something else. And I had grown up in the Pacific Northwest. I had spent a lot of time as a kid on the campus of the University of Oregon, and they just so happened to have a very strong program in island and coastal archaeology, which I had some experience with, but focused on the Pacific Rim. And so for my PhD, I ended up going to the University of Oregon and doing much of my research in Micronesia, which is a part of the world that is about as big as the United States. But when you get all of the thousands of islands together, the landmass is about the size of Rhode Island, actually. So it's a very, what I'm trying to say is these small islands that I had been working on in the Caribbean and then started working on in the Pacific were really interesting to me for a number of different reasons from a comparative standpoint. And so I've spent my career since then working on a number of different, mostly small islands, particularly limestone ones, to try and compare and contrast a lot of what we see happening in islands around the world. What I'm going to talk about tonight is a number of different things. And first off, I'm going to talk a little bit about isolation and interaction and how these debates have played out historically from an archaeological standpoint. I'll then go into a little bit of a primer on Caribbean prehistoric migrations for those of you who might not be familiar with the prehistory of the region, and talk about some things like chronological disparities, which have structured some of my ideas about how the Caribbean may have been settled prehistorically and some of the other things that have been going on and how that maybe relates to the Pacific as well. I'll use a project that I helped co-direct for more than 10 years on the small island of Carriacou in the Grenadines as a framework for introducing you to the really rich archaeological record of the Caribbean, and that helps sets the tone, I think, for a number of different issues that I bring up regarding why I think colonization and settlement patterns in the Caribbean and also in the Pacific have been structured the way they were. I'll talk about Caribbean interaction spheres, some movements of exchange of different things like stone and pottery and animals. I'll talk a little bit about some contentious and very interesting aspects of sourcing artifacts, which are really pivotal to the debate about how Caribbean Amerindians may have been moving and where they may have come from, and their contacts or potential contacts with surrounding mainland areas. So we'll talk about some reasons behind the patterning that we see, at least archaeologically. And then why winds and currents matter, and this is kind of an obvious point in some respects, but in many ways it's not, or hasn't been, at least from the Caribbean perspective. And then I'll tie in some Pacific corollaries with all of this. Okay, so going back to the early 1900s, and we're talking about Margaret Mead's research on the small island of Tau in what is now American Samoa. She and some other scholars introduced this idea, after having done research out there, of islands as laboratories, islands as cultural laboratories, to try and explain why we see, at least at this point in time in Polynesia, some of the differences culturally and linguistically and archaeologically between all of these varying island societies, knowing that they had common ancestors, but that deviated over time in many different, what appeared to be unique ways. Now, we can go back into the 1960s to a figure named Andrew Sharp, who began a debate that kind of tied in a little bit with what Tor Heyerdahl was doing with the Kon-Tiki, and made some arguments in a number of different papers that colonization of the Pacific was accidental, that Polynesians and Micronesians essentially couldn't have had the capabilities technologically, navigation-wise, et cetera, to colonize these islands. And this really spurred a debate in archaeology, because we knew historically Europeans were talking a lot about the seafaring capabilities of Polynesians and that they were exceptional. And for somebody to come in and start to make this argument, which in some ways was valid when you looked at historical contact and seeing a lot of Pacific Island groups not having the capability of long-distance voyaging, at least at that point in time, really kind of spurred this debate. And so we have at a time in the mid 20th century of this debate kind of playing out. And then we see Tor Heyerdahl, of course, in his famous voyage from South America into the Pacific Islands, and instituting these new theories that Polynesians not only were proficient seafarers, but they could have come from other places like South America, even though now that's not a widely accepted theory, but at least showed that it could have had some validity to it. Now, we've moved on into the 1980s and 1990s, and what we see in the academic literature is a lot of archaeologists working on islands in the Pacific, but also the Caribbean and other places like the Mediterranean. The pendulum has swung the other way here, in that if you have a boat, you can go wherever you want, whenever you want. And that really began to structure some theoretical ideas about how islands were colonized in different parts of the world. Now, what I've been trying to do in a lot of the papers I've been writing is kind of bring that back to the middle a little bit. And I've been influenced by a number of different people, Pat Kirch, Athol Anderson, very well-known Pacific scholars, of course John Cherry's work in the Mediterranean, Colin Renfrew, and a number of other Caribbean scholars as well, Bill Keegan, to sort of look at this contextually. That the interaction may not have been necessarily universal, it may not have been persistent through time at all points in time, but we need to look at these on kind of case-by-case studies. Okay, so this hopefully sets a little bit of a framework for where I'm going here. Now to the primer. Not to make it too complex, because we talk a lot about different kinds of migrations and who those people were, and we give lots of different names to them, but essentially I can break it down like this. There are three major regions of the Caribbean, three major island regions. We have the Greater Antilles, that's Cuba, Hispaniola, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica. We have a series of, which is a very typical island arc system of the Lesser Antilles, shown here. The Bahamas, which are technically in the Atlantic, but were settled prehistorically by peoples who came from the Caribbean, so we often put that in there. And then we also have kind of a smaller grouping of islands that are closer to South America, but which were in such close proximity to South America, or were even connected during periods of lower sea level, that we think of them differently, at least in terms of colonization and seafaring capabilities. Now, the first major migration that we see in the Caribbean is typically referred to as the Lithic or Casimiroid, that occurred around 7,000 years ago, around 5,000 BC. Now, the sites are pretty ephemeral. We don't have a lot of information about this point in time, but we do know that they settled parts of Cuba and Hispaniola. Where they came from has been debated. We don't know necessarily whether they came certainly from Mesoamerica, although that's been kind of the traditional line of thinking. I think it's equally plausible that they came from somewhere in South America. But again, the data is not really good, and we have a number of issues that have played out here politically that have made it a little more challenging for archaeologists to work in certain areas, and that includes many parts of Central America during the 1980s, Cuba, of course, parts of northern South America, Colombia and Venezuela have been very difficult to work at for just a lot of different reasons. So the data really isn't there to talk a lot about this. Now we have what looks like another major migration. This is termed the archaic or Toyroid. I'm going to quiz everybody on these terms after. This occurs around 3000 BC and goes up until about 500 BC, give or take. Now, we're pretty certain that these groups came from somewhere in Mesoamerica, and we see archaic settlements in Trinidad and Tobago, which may not be surprising because Trinidad for sure was connected to South America at this time, or in very close proximity. We have lots of sites in the northern Caribbean, particularly the northern Lesser Antilles. And while most of these islands, especially the smaller ones, just have one or two archaic sites, we have the island of Antigua, which has more than 40. And this is because we have lithic quality stone, which is comparatively rare in the Caribbean. This is they call it Long Island flint. It's kind of a chert. And we see lots of that material being moved around in the northern Caribbean. And then we also have Barbados, which has really the only unequivocal evidence for archaic settlement in the southern part of the Caribbean, apart from Trinidad and Tobago. So right here, we see some chronological disparities that are a little curious. The next major migration is what we call Saladoid. And these were once thought to be the first horticultural peoples, the first ceramic making peoples that come into the Caribbean, doing so around 2,500 years ago. We now see some evidence for archaic peoples also cultivating plants, translocating them into the Caribbean, also probably making pottery. But Saladoid is definitely a new group of people. The pottery that we see is very distinct. It's very well fired. We start to see during this period the translocation of animals coming in for the first time, lots of different mammals. And these groups are found throughout the Lesser Antilles and Puerto Rico, but then they stop. And we don't see the movement of that package of artifacts or material culture generally moving westward or moving north. So again, we see some kind of strange chronological disparities going on here. Now, there's been some debate, and if you were to ask most Caribbean archaeologists up until the mid-2000s how the Caribbean was settled by Saladoid groups, they would say, well, it was settled in a stepping stone pattern in this northward progression from South America, because the pottery that we see that's very common in this area is also found in northern South America. And from a biogeographical perspective, this makes sense. You can't see Grenada from South America, but it's not that far away. So once you get there, most of the other islands are intervisible. You can stand on, which I've done, stand on the very high points of these islands, and you can see all the way to St. Vincent. And when you get to St. Vincent, you can see St. Lucia, and so on. It's a very geologically young island arc system, lots of volcanoes, lots of active volcanism during the Holocene, and even today, as John Cherry is very well aware, having done quite a bit of research on Montserrat. And so we see this pattern kind of playing out. Now, just sort of keep that in the back of your mind, and I'll revisit this in a minute. Now, you don't need to pay attention to all these colors, but what I do want to point out is that we have some, again, chronological disparities here. So we see Cuba and Hispaniola and Puerto Rico settled between 5,000 to 3,000 BC. We also see a lot of the northern Lesser Antilles settled about the same time. We see the Dutch Antilles here, 3000 BC, Trinidad pretty early, but here, the Southern Caribbean, the Bahamas, Jamaica, they're all settled very late. And this doesn't seem to be an artifact of survey or lack thereof. We have done lots of research on these islands, and these are the earliest dates we have, so that's what we have to use. What can explain this? Okay. Now, back to the Saladoid issue, we see this distinctive, what's called Zickware, zone-incised crosshatch pottery, showing up in South America. And an archaeologist named Richard Callahan at the University of Calgary back in the late 1980s, early 1990s, devised a simulation program for seafaring. And in his program, he could say, okay, if you're in this kind of boat and you left from point A, where would you end up, given all the prevailing winds and currents? And these data were derived from U.S. Coast Guard and Navy buoys that had been moving around. They'd been keeping track of winds and currents and sea temperature and everything else. And what he presented at our International Congress, which is every 2 years, he said, well, it's most likely that people, if they left North and South America, would have gotten to Puerto Rico or the Virgin Islands first. And he was literally run out of the room. Right? This was a very big contrast to traditional thinking that peoples moved in this stepping stone pattern. He suggested that, well, people probably got up here first and then they came back down. And then only later, when we see kind of these late radiocarbon dates, are people settling this part. Okay? So again, we see some new ideas coming in that are changing how we think of these islands being settled. In 2006, I published a paper where I collected all the radiocarbon dates I could find, and what these radiocarbon dates showed after I got rid of the really bad ones, and there were quite a few of them that had poor, provenience, that were culturally ambiguous, that were found in weird places, or didn't have a lot of information, and it supported this pattern of population dispersal. It basically followed pretty much exactly what Richard Callahan had demonstrated using these seafaring simulations. Okay? So perhaps it's not done in the way we think, but it's moving in the other direction. Okay? So just kind of think about that for a minute and hold on to it, and then I'll get back to it again. Okay? When we look at evidence for the connections that the Caribbean islands may have had to surrounding mainland areas, we know that South America was playing a strong role. We see it iconographically, we see it archaeologically, we see it in many different facets. And there's been many arguments or many ideas that they also had connections to other surrounding mainland areas. But the fact remains that we don't have any hard evidence for connections to South Florida, despite the close proximity of the Bahamas and Cuba in particular. We don't really have any good evidence for this area up here in the Gulf Coast, despite a lot of the currents kind of moving up. We have a loop current that kind of comes up through here and back around. No good evidence here. We really don't have any good evidence for Mexico. Some of the evidence we see might point to connections or at least some similarities in iconographic imagery coming from parts of Central America, especially the Isthmo-Colombian region like Costa Rica, Panama, Colombia. We don't see Bermuda settled prehistorically. We don't even have any archaeological evidence for the Cayman Islands, and people have tried to look on numerous occasions. So what we have here, again, is lots of evidence from South America, but nothing really from the surrounding mainland regions, which is a bit curious. Okay. Now, let me set it up in terms of what we see archaeologically, and I would be remiss if I just showed you pictures of maps. I need to show you some artifacts and things like that, because that's the really interesting stuff. So in 2003, I started an archaeological project on the small island of Carriacou, which is in the southern Grenadines. And the general goals of this project that I did with both Dutch and British co-directors was we wanted to determine when this island was settled, and we eventually spread out to some of the other smaller islands around. We wanted to test some theories on human dispersal because the fact remained that the southern Caribbean had received a lot less attention archaeologically than the northern Caribbean for a number of reasons. And then we wanted to understand and examine the artifactual assemblages and how we might be able to connect the dots with this small island and also a number of other islands around using a variety of methodological procedures and analytical techniques, provenience studies of sourcing pottery and other types of materials, and looking at some of the plants and animals that were coming in. Okay, so Carriacou is the largest island in the Grenadines, but it's only about 13 square miles, 30 or so square kilometers. And we have a couple dozen islands that are in the Grenadines. The larger ones are labeled here. Okay. And, oops, let me go back here. Sometimes these animations have, anyway. So we have Carriacou, which is politically part of Grenada, along with the larger island of Grenada and Petite Martinique. Here. And what we did early on during our survey was we wanted to go to areas which we knew previously had good evidence for pre-Columbian settlements, or ones that we knew that based on our predictions would probably have pretty good clues to people settling there at some point in the past. And so what we did is we targeted these green areas here, mostly coastal areas, ones that we got permission to visit, and we either relocated or we identified a number of new archaeological sites, 13 in total. The red ones here are ones that had really good evidence for prehistoric settlement in the sense that they were larger villages. Two of these, Grand Bay and Sabazan, which were on the east coast, had not only really good evidence, but they were also succumbing pretty rapidly to erosion for a number of reasons, which I'll talk about. So we decided to focus on these two, especially Grand Bay, and we also had a doctoral student who did her dissertation research on Sabazan, which wasn't too far from there. Okay. So here's looking from the main town of Hillsborough. This gives you kind of a little idea of, it's a very iconic Caribbean, especially in the Lesser Antilles, these mountainous islands, very nice beaches. And Carriacou is kind of what a lot of the Caribbean looked like in the 1950s. It's still very rustic, not a lot of tourists, not a lot of development, and in that sense we were very lucky because tourism is a main income generator for many of these islands, and coastal areas are often sought after by hotels and other types of tourist activities. So Carriacou was spared in that sense, and we were pretty fortunate. This is the east side of Carriacou, showing where the Grand Bay site is. We see Petite Dominica, which is an uninhabited island just offshore, Petite Martinique, which has about 1,000 inhabitants, and then Petite St. Vincent, which is a private island, and that's where Oprah likes to take her vacations. We've tried to visit on a number of different times and been pushed off for some reason. A dirty archaeologist getting out of some skiff. So. But it gives you a sense of what it kind of looks like today. Now, here's Grand Bay looking south, and this right here is all archaeological material. It's pottery, shell, midden material, human remains, architectural features like postholes, and this is just really 1/3 of the site that you see here. So this is a huge site. It's probably the most intact and largest site in the Southern Caribbean, and there really had been no archaeological work done here. So this was a great opportunity for us. So we've done a number of different long-term field projects between 6 and 8 weeks each time. So 7 major field seasons. With dozens and dozens of students and other specialists. And we also have a nice coastal profile, so we know pretty much what we're going to find, how deep it is, etc. And you can clearly see the midden deposits between the subsoil. So we had lots of good kind of preparation to move into this site. We've done a number of different things. We've created three-dimensional visualizations. We have brought in our total station, and we take elevation maps of everything we do, maps of the coastal profile. We really have high-resolution data from this site, and that's what we wanted to do from the get-go, is make sure that the material we collected was done in a way that we could answer a lot of these questions that we had. The whole site is separated into 5 by 5 meter grids, sub-separated into 1 by 1 meter units. And so this is just kind of a visualization of what the site looks like in terms of vegetation and 3 dimensions. So here's a photograph of the site in 1999 when my colleagues first visited. And you can see it's got a gently sloping profile. All of this is archaeological material on the surface. But we were very struck by what we saw in following years. So if you use, there's a leaning manchineel tree up here on the cusp of that bracket. And the end of it is where it was in 1999. This is 2003, this is 2004, 2005, 2007. Yeah, so you can see this site is quickly eroding, which is one of the other reasons why we targeted it. Because we've mapped this in detail, we now have a good digital record of this, so we can overlay photographs. And basically the site was eroding at an average rate of 1 meter a year, which was pretty astounding. But this wasn't solely due to natural processes. This was also due primarily to sand mining that was being done. So we'd get all these lorries that would come down to the beach, dozens sometimes during low tide. They would remove that sand buffer. Normally we'd get this, natural sand buffer that was kind of at an incline that would protect that coastal profile. They were removing that, so it was undercutting that profile, and then it was slumping over. And combined with the occasional hurricane and other tropical storms, it was really destroying the site very badly. So part of our work was a lot of public archaeology and trying to get the word out to government officials that this activity really needed to stop. This was an excavation unit that we had started just 2 years previous, and you can see it's the erosion, which was so quick, was coming in and really taking a lot of that material away. And ironically, this was happening just north of Grand Bay. They were sand mining the same site, and the local population, which are descended from African slaves, really didn't have a lot. This has been a problem in many parts of the Caribbean where they don't have that ancestral connection. And so the preservation of pre-Columbian material, which often takes the form of things that look like, they don't look like much, broken pieces of shell, pottery which looks like rock, and so on. But they were doing it in this area, and they became pretty alarmed when their own grandparents, literally their grandparents, were being washed into the sea as a result of this activity. And this is what it looks like about a year ago. So this has been a very disturbing aspect of what we've done, because the same sort of thing is happening, but to this pre-Columbian site. So what we did is we compiled a large corpus of radiocarbon dates at both sites, and we have now a chronology that suggests the island was settled around AD 400, supporting the few archaeological sites and dates that had come from other nearby islands. So again, settled very late in time during this general ceramic age. Lots of really cool artifacts, shell fish hooks and ornaments and beads. A lot of stuff that we rarely find sometimes in archaeological sites, particularly these fish hooks, of which there's a paucity for some reason. Queen conch, or what is now called Lobatus gigas, I think. Lots of shell tools and things. This is one of the most important marine resources for Caribbean Amerindians, so they would eat the meat and then use that raw material for making a wide variety of different objects. The occasional stone tool or coral implement, like this coral pestle, but not too many lithics generally. Lots of good pottery. Some of the finest pottery in the New World is found in the Caribbean. Some really interesting things. These are called adornos. They take the shape of humans or animals, and they're often used as handles on vessels or plates. Just a few examples of what these look like. Some of these are really interesting. Some are duomorphs. So you look at it one way and it might look like a pelican, and you turn it another way and it looks like a bird, or another bird, or a mammal or something. So lots of dual imagery that happens as well. Just a selection of some of these that we found over the years. These right here, this and the top left are body stamps. So these are ceramic. They would dip these in some type of pigment and they'd use that to adorn the body, which was well known ethnographically and recorded by historic chroniclers. And then we have spindle whorls here for making cordage. There's a native cotton, so they're making lots of different textiles. They're making hammocks, which is a Caribbean word. So lots of different kinds of iconographic objects or different implements. These are other body stamps, and some of these are cylindrical, so they can roll over the body and repeat the pattern, which are kind of neat. And then this one here, which not too many of these are found, but the triangle is a very important image or design for the Caribbean. We see the triangle motif being repeated in ceramics, in stone, and petroglyphs, and these are thought to represent the shape of the islands as you see them from the sea, kind of, or see them from other islands. Kind of a testament to the importance that these kinds of islands played in their general lifeways. And you see that triangle motif repeated within the interior of this body stamp. And this is just an illustration of how these body stamps may have looked and how Amerindians may have decorated their body for different, mostly ritual purposes. Not a lot of, I mean, we have hundreds of thousands of sherds that we found over the years. Not too many whole or complete vessels, but we have found a few. It shows a few examples. And very nicely designed. Lots of different beautiful slips, oranges and reds, blacks and whites. This occurs around AD 1000, known as Trumazoid. Interior incision on bowls and plates. And then one of the curious things that we began to think about was, well, we have a very late settlement period of the Grenadines compared to other islands. And one of the features of the Grenadines is that they have no permanent sources of fresh water. So peoples would have either had to use some kind of catchment system, or they would have had to tap the Geibben-Herzberg lens, which is a lens of fresh water that sits above the salt water. Now, one of the things we see in the archaeological record that is generally coeval with settlement of those islands are what we call potstacks. These are large ceramic bowls that are fired and decorated, and then they punch the bottom out, and then they stack them in holes. They line wells in order to support the structural integrity of that. And so we see this technology being used almost exclusively in the Southern Caribbean. We see it in Barbados, we see it in the Grenadines, St. Vincent, St. Lucia, Grenada. And this is a technology that seems maybe was even implemented or designed by people who were living in the Grenadines and then passed along to other places where they would get water shortages. And certainly they were going through periods of drought. Postholes, which give us an indication of how large these structures may have been, perfectly just circular, sometimes lined with stone or pottery, the occasional artifact found. And then we also see larger trash pits, which may have just been extensions of older post holes, but we see nice stratigraphy sometimes in these as well. And we've even seen these in excavations. So this is one of our 5 by 5 meter units, and you can see this very clearly, and this line of charred seeds that have come in, which is pretty extraordinary. I showed pictures of this to Lee Newsom, who is an archaeobotanist at Penn State, and she's looked at a lot of these, a lot of the archaeobotanical remains from the Caribbean, and she has never seen such a concentration of these anywhere in the Caribbean. And so we have on this small little island lots of kind of weird things or different things going on. Quite a couple dozen human remains that are found. And one of the practices, one of the mortuary behaviors was to bury these individuals underneath the house, adjacent to the posts. So we see that represented here. And I mentioned earlier that we had only found a few intact ceramic vessels, and we doubled that with one burial just a few years ago. So we have this individual that is surrounded by several complete vessels lying on its left side. And these are those reconstructed. So that was a very nice aspect of working at the site. And then just a little farther north, we have another site that was found just a few years ago after some more erosion, mostly surface erosion. We'll typically get locals that will come by and they'll say, oh, I found some bones, some human bones, and they'll end up being cattle or sheep or something. And we had a fisherman come by and he said, oh, I found some human bones coming out of the surface over in this area. And we said, well, we surveyed that area. We didn't see anything. It must be cattle. So, we graciously went with them, and sure enough, there was a skull just popping out of the surface, which was clearly human. And so with lots of midden material around it, which had been recently eroded sometime in the past year. And this was also a very unusual burial. I haven't really seen this kind of burial before in the Caribbean. Some scholars early on had alluded to things like this happening, but this was an individual that was buried surrounded by stones. And interestingly, as we excavated down, we could see that the individual was buried with a very large flat stone in the lap. It turned out to be a female in her early 20s, and then clutching another stone, buried in kind of a fetal position, more like a cross-legged position. And so surrounded by stones, holding these, and that's a very unusual burial practice generally, especially in the Caribbean, almost as if this individual, the people who buried her didn't want her to get up in the afterlife. And sometimes you see this kind of practice in different parts of the world where there's some type of mystical reason. Maybe this person was a witch and had caused some strife or problems, and they just didn't want her to get up. It's all speculation, but I don't know, seems to make sense to me. So here's this larger stone, and this weighs about 30 pounds. I don't know why. It would have been like this. And then one of my students kind of replicating the position here. We went back a couple years ago and found another burial that was eroding out, and very, very close to that one as well. Okay, so we have the Carriacou project that I think gives you a little bit of an idea of some of the things that we find generally in terms of artifacts and mortuary behaviors and things like that. Now, what's the evidence that we see for interaction and exchange around the Caribbean, using this as kind of a foundation for answering some of those questions? Well, we have a number of different kinds of stone that's found in the Caribbean that does not seem to be local. In particular, we see this, which is a jadeite or jadeite, that many scholars that had found this in the Caribbean had argued that it was coming from somewhere in Mesoamerica, where these jades, jadeites, were widely used by peoples in Mexico, the Maya, Zapotec, and other people, and was widely traded around. And we see iconographic imagery like the artifacts illustrated at the top right that are also common in other parts, especially the Istmo-Colombian region. We have serpentinite that we can add to this, kind of a yellowish stone, and this has been argued by some scholars to represent the Andean condor, which is not local to the Caribbean, not found. And so over the years, we have, especially over the last 10 years, a segment of Caribbean scholars have been making a very vocal argument for the iconography and the material type being indicative of connections to this part of the mainland. Okay, we have other materials like this gold-copper alloy, which is known as guanine or tumbaga in the Istmo-Colombian region, and then a number of other kind of artifacts which seem to suggest linkages to mainland areas. These are unique to the Caribbean. These are stools or bowls used in rituals to ingest Cahoba, which is a hallucinogenic substance. It comes from Anandenanthera peregrina, which contains DMT, or dimethyltryptamine, which is a very, very powerful hallucinogen, which was brought in from South America and used in the Caribbean. And this is one of these spoons used in ritual events. It was recorded historically for this purpose. Here we see an artifact, artifact type known as a zemi. This is, you can kind of think of this as the spiritual manifestation of Amerindian spirituality. These are called three-pointers sometimes, but they take a number of different shapes, a number of different kinds of media, and we also find these in the southern Caribbean, which seems to be a clear connection to the Greater Antilles with Taino groups that Columbus first met. So we see the movement of these ideas, people, imagery that's making their way down into the southern part of the Caribbean in later prehistory and is present at historic contact. We find these in Carriacou. And in fact, a couple years ago, the one on the left here was, well, we had found these two in the top right, more generic. And very typical of what we find in the Northern Caribbean as well. But the one on the left has this face. It's huge. We found this eroding out of the coastal profile during the last week of the project, as these things sometimes happen. And this is the largest one that's been found in the Lesser Antilles that I know of, south of Guadeloupe. So a big part of the Caribbean. This is a big one. And that also is kind of unique because there's been a lot of archaeological research in some of these other islands around the Grenadines, and nothing like this has been found before. So again, Carriacou, not to overstate the importance of this island just because I work on it, but we're finding some unique and interesting things. I don't want anybody to have to memorize these maps, but what I do want you to pay attention to is the sequence of interaction networks that seem to be taking place based on evidence that's been collected from a variety of different artifacts and stone types. So we see here in what we call the early ceramic age, kind of the first stage of this, these exchange networks really ramping up in the Northern Caribbean. And that's where they're primarily taking place. And as we go through time, a few hundred years later, we see an expansion of this that includes the Southern Caribbean and that seems to connect South America in a more direct way. You can see the movements of these things changing over time, the movement of different kinds of stone. The white lines are Long Island flint, which is found on Antigua with all these archaic sites and still used during the ceramic age. We see different kinds of style zones, and they're fluctuating through time. For reasons that we're not yet clear about, but it is clear that we see a lot of different island groups that seem to be doing different things and becoming more territorial and resisting contact with other places for whatever reason. And then as we get closer to European contact, we again see these divisions kind of fluxing through time. And we see a separation in some cases of existing exchange networks that now no longer exist. Okay. Importantly, we see the movement of what we might think of as prestige goods, this gold-copper alloy, translocated animals, and other things that now are becoming paramount at the later stages of prehistory and up to European contact. Okay, so this brings us to, where are these things coming from and how are they getting there? Well, jadeite sources, this greenstone that was found not infrequently in the Northern Caribbean, was argued initially to come from Mesoamerica. And since then, over the last 5 or 6 years, we've found sources, local sources in the Caribbean. So the point being that these Mesoamerican connections that people had been making an argument for don't seem to hold as much water as was once thought. We see serpentinite also playing this role where it was once thought it was coming just from this part of Mesoamerica, up here around Costa Rica and northern Panama somewhere, but we also now are finding other sources in South America. So I think what this is showing is that South America is still playing a very prominent role here in connections, and that Mesoamerica probably isn't. And I would argue, this is a talk for another time, but you just do not see the kinds of things that you would expect to see in the Caribbean if they had sustained and intense contacts with Mesoamerica. Okay? I'm talking about Mayan groups, Aztec, whatever, peoples where we had Teotihuacan, right? All these extensive exchange networks that are happening in Mesoamerica, the monumental architecture, the intensive agriculture of terraces and irrigation networks. We just do not see any of that in the Caribbean. Okay. Obsidian is a big one, and I've found, people are writing about this in the Caribbean. There's been one flake of obsidian, one undisputed flake of obsidian found in the Caribbean. And them making the connection, it must have come from South America, right? That's where they're using it. That's where they're found. And you'll find this in literature occasionally. Well, the fact is most obsidian that we find in this part of the world is found in Mesoamerica. Lots of different sources clustering here, up there in the Valley of Mexico, south of the Yucatan, the Mayan lowlands. But we also find obsidian in South America, and it's because people are now looking for it. This flake found on Puerto Rico, I've taken issue with, and that is because obsidian often flows in pumice floats. It often accompanies the development of pumice during volcanic eruptions. And we find obsidian in the Pacific on atolls, in pre-archaeological deposits associated with pumice. So it can float like that. And you'll see veins of obsidian in pumice. Okay? So you can't necessarily discount this. Okay? Pumice is a great dispersal mechanism for biological organisms. It moves around a lot, and it's been used by marine biologists to look at speciation events on different islands or coastal regions. And a few years ago, there was a paper published looking at pumice flows around the world. This is in 2012, and looking at historic eruptions, and you can see that pumice can move fairly easily from its source to areas very, very far away, and that's also the case for the Caribbean. Okay. We've done a lot of mineralogical analysis of pottery on Carriacou, and one of the things I've always been astounded with is 90% of the artifacts found in the Caribbean are pottery, they're ceramic. But there's very little provenience study of ceramics, at least pre-Columbian material. So we've done a lot of this on Carriacou and other islands. We've identified numerous different temper types and published this. And one of the things that we did a few years ago is this cohoba, this hallucinogenic substance is brought into the Caribbean from South America, has paraphernalia attached to it. And we see this in the archaeological record, although it's not well dated at all. We had the opportunity in Carriacou, because we had found one of these fragment of an inhaling bowl here on the left, and some unprovenienced samples that were also found in the local museum. We did some thermoluminescence dating on these, and we also did mineralogical analysis to see where the ceramics may have been coming from. This just shows some of these dried seeds from the legume it comes from, and it's still practiced by peoples in Amazonia today, Yanomamo groups. And we published a paper a few years ago looking at this, and essentially what it showed was the dates for these inhaling bowls were hundreds and hundreds of years earlier than the accepted archaeological chronologies for the island. And because the mineralogy showed that those vessels, those artifacts were not made on Carriacou, they looked to be heirlooms. So this is another way that we've been able to reconstruct some of these exchange networks going on, and basically suggest that we have peoples that are coming from the north and moving into the south, just like we've been seeing over the centuries. Okay. And these are just some of the potential ceramic sources for this. I mentioned translocated animals earlier. Interestingly, we have quite a few animals being brought in, but it's happening relatively late in time. The opossum and the goody are the two most common, but we also have guinea pig, peccary, armadillo, even now paca, which has been found in Carriacou. We have red brocket deer artifacts. This is a polished mandible that's been incised that has this drilled, again in that triangle kind of shape, which is common. And so on Carriacou, when we look at where these translocated animals are found, we see more on Carriacou pretty much than we do on any other island in the Caribbean, which is kind of strange. The red brocket deer, I was talking to Anna Roosevelt a couple years ago about this, who's a pretty well-known Amazonian archaeologist, and I said, we found this cool artifact, but they probably weren't brought in live or anything. She said, no, I won't discount that they could have been, because people in Amazonia keep them as pets all the time. They're very docile. And we have since then found some metapodials that have been scored and broken in our archaeological deposits. So it's a potential there for bringing in deer, which would be pretty interesting as well. Okay, so what factors, when you consider all of this evidence, what factors are influencing this exchange and interaction that's been going on and documented in the Caribbean? Well, when we look at the oceanographic effects, this is just a simple map showing the prevailing currents. We have the Caribbean current that comes in here. It continues on, forming the Yucatan current. It forms the loop current, then moves into the Florida current, and then forms the Gulf Stream. The Gulf Stream moves more water than all of the world's rivers combined. Okay? And it's fast. It's fast and it's powerful. Okay? This right here is influenced not only by the movement of the Atlantic into the Caribbean, but also the discharge from the Orinoco and the Amazon and lots of other tributaries. So we get seasonal intensity of that after a 3 or 4 month delay of Andean spring melts that also intensify this. Okay? When they go through this island arc system right here, the currents bottleneck through the islands. So they intensify. And it's very difficult, even in the Grenadines, to go from one island to the next. It may look calm, but when you get in there, those troughs are massive even during calm days. So it's pretty hazardous, in other words. This is a map of the winds. The intensity of the winds and the duration of those shown in the darker and the longer arrows. And you can see they also follow, to a great degree, those currents. And it's not unusual to have sustained prevailing winds, these prevailing, especially in the southern Caribbean, that are 10 to 15 miles per hour. Combined with the currents that are moving generally about 3 to 4 kilometers an hour, this is going to be pretty difficult to make headway, essentially. Okay? Now, in terms of seafaring capabilities in the Caribbean, there's not a lot of good evidence, and that's the case in most parts of the world. What we do have are 2 canoes that have been found. One is called the Stargate canoe. It was found in the Bahamas. It dates after AD 600. And then we have an undated series of fragments from Las Puchones in Cuba, okay, which I hope are dated soon. We have some paddles. 9 or 10 have been found over the years in a number of different places. Okay? And then we have ethnohistoric evidence, which shows that peoples in the Caribbean were very capable seafarers, but they were using dugout canoes. We have no evidence for the sail. We have one ethnohistoric record of this by Valdez, who said they sail or navigate with sails of cotton. But this could also be translated as they have awnings of cotton on their boat, which was well recorded historically. Okay, so we have no evidence for the sail. We have no evidence for outriggers. We have no evidence for any other kind of stabilization technique for dugout canoes. We have some evidence for them building wash strakes on the top of dugout canoes to form the gunwale to kind of raise the freeboard a little bit, but that seems very, very rare too. So we don't have the outrigger, we don't have the sail. We have dugout canoes. Now, if we look at the Pacific Ocean, which is 1/3 of the world's surface area, which is 60 times the size of the Caribbean, and thousands of islands versus dozens of large ones, okay? This seems to be a little different than the Caribbean in many ways, right? The Caribbean in size, generally shown here against Polynesia. Okay? Now, in other words, what's driving these technological innovations? Okay? In Polynesia, we have the double-hulled canoe. This is the what modern-day catamarans are based on. There's lots of good historical accounts of Polynesians and their double-hulled canoes. You know, you'd see in a ship's log for some of these big square-rigged ships, they'd say, oh, you know, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, we saw a speck on the horizon, and as it got closer, it was clear it was a Polynesian double-hulled canoe, and they literally sailed circles around it before kind of going off, because they could harness the wind much more efficiently and go much faster than these square-rigged ships. They were very proficient. But the Polynesian double-hulled canoe seems to be a relatively late invention that allowed them to settle East Polynesia. So we've been doing a lot of computer simulations of seafaring to kind of test these ideas. And I won't go into this too much, but suffice to say we can put in lots of different variables. Current patterns, winds, vessels, propulsion type, whether people are paddling or not. And this has been applied to the Caribbean. And so back to what Richard Callahan had done to try and postulate what was showing, what was kind of trying to explain the chronological disparities, is that it's very easy to go between South America and the northern Antilles, just like this. So if you leave Hispaniola, this is where you end up. And incidentally, the Lake Maracaibo region right here of Colombia has the most frequent and most intense lightning storms anywhere in the world. They have something like 250 nights a year have these huge lightning storms, which was used by the Spanish as a navigation device, or as a navigation guide, rather, wayfinding. And so it's quite possible, I think, that Amerindians were doing that as well. So in other words, we can go back and forth between South America and the Caribbean islands pretty easily, but going to Mesoamerica and coming back, going to North America, coming back, is much more difficult. Okay? When we get back to this map of chronological disparities, green being very early, red being very late or non-existent, the oceanographic effects, the winds, seem to be driving technological innovations or lack thereof. In other words, they had the dugout canoe, they used it well, but they didn't need anything else to travel between the islands. Okay? When we look at Austronesian movements in the Pacific, these are the first groups that are getting out to remote Oceania. What we see here is a pattern of people settling Micronesia around 3500 BP, and then moving out these tendrils, these pulses of movement by what we call Lapita groups into West Polynesia between 3400 and 3000 BP. But what we have here is a movement north 1500 years later, but there's no movement further eastward until about 900 to 1000 BP. There's a 2,000-year gap between when Samoa and Tonga are settled and then the rest of the Polynesian Triangle, Hawaii, Easter Island, and New Zealand. But once that happens, boom, they're out there. They go to Hawaii, they go there, and then they go there within a few hundred years. It happens almost instantaneously in a huge expanse of ocean. So it's likely then that people's because they had developed the double-hulled canoe to carry more people and provisions, essentially allowed them to move eastward. And there's also an argument to be made that increased intensity of El Nino events during the late Holocene also would have spurred this as well, and there's been some documentation for that. Okay, when you look at the winds and currents in the Pacific, you see that the same thing is happening as the Caribbean. It's basically an east to west movement of winds and currents. But essentially, Pacific Islanders, because they had a much stronger tradition of seafaring, they were able to harness and recognize oscillating wind patterns and other things, seem to have been able to do this much more effectively because they had developed the sail and the outrigger. They would not have been able to move in this direction or any of these directions with simply dugout canoes. It doesn't matter how many people you have paddling, you simply would not have been able to make headway during most times of the year, except maybe during the occasional El Nino event where things change very differently. Okay, so we have this settlement pattern here, and then this long pause. Okay, this. I've been working with a climatologist at Ohio State named Alvaro Montenegro, and you don't really need to know much about this schematic other than this yellow area in here, which is the gap between East Polynesia and West Polynesia. And in here we have less wind intensity, and we have a greater spatial distribution of islands. In other words, they're farther apart in this gap. So what we see here is basically what appears to be a technological innovation of that Polynesian double-hulled canoe, the development of what's termed the crab claw sail, which could harness the wind much more effectively than other types of sails. And this basically allowed them to kind of push out into the farthest nodes of East Polynesia. So in conclusion, when we look at all of the information in the Caribbean and a little bit in the Pacific, we see that the currents and winds were extremely influential in structuring how these islands were settled. The Caribbean, these winds and currents facilitated travel between South America and the Northern Caribbean, and then it looks like peoples, based on radiocarbon chronologies and everything else, look to make their way down southward instead of northward. But this hampered the development of seafaring technologies. Essentially, necessity is the mother of invention. They did not need to develop the sail in the Caribbean because they simply didn't need it. In the Pacific, we see the development of specific kinds of technologies that look to have solved this problem of eastward movement. And we see a lot of oral traditions, even a lot of historical accounts in the Pacific of people still not being able to make successful voyages, of disappearing altogether. And so even these make voyaging quite hazardous. The Pacific itself is a misnomer. The Pacific was named by Magellan, and Magellan, who came into the Pacific after a harrowing venture through the straits that bear his name, came into a calm sea, Mare Pacifico, right? But subsequent voyages had no such luck. And I've published a paper with Richard Callahan a number of years ago that made the argument that the reason why, when we did computer simulations of Magellan's voyage, and tracked it, the best explanation was, based on comparative archaeological and paleo-environmental data, that he encountered that during a very intense El Nino year, which allowed him to make that voyage. So that drastically structured things historically, this climatic event. And these kinds of things are also appearing to structure earlier Polynesian colonization. So essentially, we cannot think of watercraft as these passive platforms. Interaction was not universal. Isolation was not universal either. It is historically contingent. It is also environmentally dependent in many ways. And this, I think, helps explain a lot of these patterns of population dispersal that we see in both the Caribbean and the Pacific. And while not being environmentally deterministic, it does show that peoples are responding to different kinds of variables and adapting technologies to respond to those. So thank you very much. And I'm happy to answer any questions that people may have.
First of all, thanks. Excellent talk. Do you have any plans to do any sea trials with dugout canoes? To actually just test it out?
You're tugging at the heartstrings here. Yes, I've talked to a number of people about doing these. There have been a number of experimental voyages in the Pacific in particular. So we were talking about this as a group earlier with some of the students, but the Hokulea, which was kind of started the Polynesian Voyaging Society back in the 1970s, basically building a replica of a Polynesian double-hulled canoe to show that you could, with the right navigational knowledge and wayfinding knowledge, travel very long distances. And this was based out of Hawaii and went down to the ancestral homeland, which was thought to be in the Society Islands, French Polynesia. There have since been a number of groups in Micronesia and Polynesia that have kind of adapted this model and been making these voyages. So I've never accompanied one, but I would of course love to. There was an attempt in the Caribbean by a French archaeologist named Bérard Benoit, who constructed a dugout canoe. And they wanted to show that Amerindians were perfectly capable of going between the islands. And I think they demonstrated that very, very well. Interestingly, I was traveling to Carriacou on the ferry from Grenada to try and meet him, and we were a little bit late, and we passed his canoe on the ferry. And so I waved to Bérard in the canoe as they went by. And I talked to him later, and I said, "How did the voyage go?" And he said, "It was great. We did everything that we kind of wanted to do, but after we saw you, we tried to get to Grenada and we couldn't because the currents and the winds were so strong, and they were just going southward. They actually had to settle. They had a port on an intervening island because they couldn't make headway. It took them 2 days to make that voyage, and it's not very far. And that's something that also sailors know very well in the Caribbean. You don't sail along the east sides of the islands, very close to the islands, because the squalls form, those winds and currents are continually pushing you westward. And an interesting side note to what you brought up, Barbados, which is the easternmost island in the Lesser Antilles, is the only island in the Caribbean that never changed hands between colonial powers. The British, once they got it in the early 1600s, kept it. That's compared to all the other islands, it's the only one that happened to. But that wasn't because the others didn't try. The French and the Dutch tried on different occasions to get to Barbados from Martinique, from Dominica, I think, and they couldn't do it. They couldn't do it because you had to hit Barbados just right coming in from the Atlantic, and if you passed it, you were screwed. You couldn't get back. You just couldn't get back. And that was much to the chagrin of the French, mostly, who have this history of the British, of course, but much to their chagrin because Barbados was a cash cow more than any other Caribbean island. Matt could correct me on that, but they were a cash cow for the sugar production and made the British very wealthy. And the French would have liked to have their piece of that pie, but they didn't. So my answer is no, but I would like to, yeah.
When well, first of all, it was great, thank you, really enjoyed it. And I think, what you said about currents and winds is very convincing, but to what extent would those be affected by different climatic circumstances?
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned El Nino, which is more of an episodic one, but if you got really more humid or whatever situations, different rain periods, I really have no idea what the on these latitudes, particularly what the influence of that all is.
So in terms of how they may have structured that, or how the
is that affected by that sort of factor?
Yes. So one of the most common questions, especially in terms of using computer simulations, is how does that modern day, is that a good analog for what was going on in the past? And this is also a question brought up in earlier discussions I had with some of the students. And the short answer is that there hasn't been a lot, we're talking about kind of relatively short time periods, recent time periods. So once sea levels stabilize, and even before that, there doesn't seem to be much change in the Caribbean and most parts of the Pacific in the general prevailing currents and winds, at least when you look at the movement of different biota to different places and a slew of other lines of evidence. It doesn't seem to have changed that much. So I think they're a pretty good analog. I do think that there are lots of different subtle variations that are probably structuring this as well. El Nino is a common one that's explained, it's used as an explanatory mechanism for maybe peoples eventually moving out into East Polynesia like Hawaii and New Zealand. But there are also like what are called Madden-Julian oscillations, which are episodic winds that come every 60 to 90 days. That I think also were probably affecting how people moved around, just kind of waiting for that to happen, and maybe even going to intervening islands, waiting for it to happen again, because going against the wind is really a difficult. I mean, it's not like going we're not talking about Euclidean distance. We're talking about the zigzag tacking pattern or shunting that's used to do it. So even a short distance can take quite a while sometimes. And so we're looking into that more and more. There's a climatologist at the University of Miami who's a specialist in these smaller oscillations, and we're kind of working through that and then trying to inject that into some of these simulations that we're doing. But certainly there's lots of things going on, and precipitation is also another one. And Alvaro Montenegro, who I mentioned earlier, he's got lots of new high-resolution precipitation data that could be used as a proxy for storm activity in conjunction with the paleoenvironmental record in different places to maybe use those as variables too to try and explain how people got out to some places and not others. The first island settled, which I think it's kind of funny and interesting, that the first island settled in remote Oceania is Guam. It's got the earliest dates. It's earlier than anything else in Melanesia and West Polynesia as far as Lapita is concerned. And Guam is way out there. Like, it's way out there. And essentially you can't get to Guam from the Philippines. You just can't get there. You have to go up north and then hope you catch this little loop current and come back down. Once you get there, it's easy to go back. But it's impossible. I wouldn't say it's impossible. It would have taken some extraordinary event for people to get there. And I think that there are other variables we just can't see or haven't recognized that are that would explain some of these events. So it's interesting that Guam is the first one settled. It's also the island where Magellan goes, the first European in that part of the world in remote Oceania. So interesting tidbit. But yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Unless there are any questions, please help. Let's thank.
Thank you very much.